evening, everyone, and thank you for logging in to the Blueprint Special Education Work Group. We have posted our Zoom disclaimer, which has been up for a little bit. Brian, could you switch to the next slide, please? Just advertising what we're doing here. If you could, please ensure that your name appears correctly on your screen. This will make it easier for us later in the presentation as we move you into breakout groups. It'll help us to know who is in the room. If you follow these directions, hover over your name and select more, you can actually tap your name if you're on a mobile, and then just rename the title if it's, in some cases, I know I've logged in with my kids' machine, so it looks like it's them. The next slide, please. And then also, if you require translation into Spanish or into another language, this is how you do that. And if you require closed captioning, you can click on the closed caption. There should also be a captioner. And if there is a personal captioner, we will post that in the chat box. Thank you. And with that, I will hand it off to our co-chairs, Ms. Zogby, and I'm not sure if Dr. Wright is on yet.
Dr. Wright is here.
Oh, perfect.
Well, I'll just start by saying I just want to thank all of you for your due diligence with hanging in with the work group. I know that these meetings sometimes are not always easy to make. I know this is a tough week. This is a graduation week for a lot of people. And so thank you to those that could be here. We certainly understand for those that are not. And thank you for continuing to provide the input that we need in order to make good decisions moving forward. So Liz, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Dr. Wright. Yeah, thanks everybody for being here. And I hope that those who are unable to join us because of great celebrations of our students across the state will be able to watch the recording and still provide us with their feedback and thoughts about this really, really important topic of adequate funding. You know, I was thinking about this topic and how, you know, over this last 8 sessions, we've really built sort of piece by piece a picture of what students with disabilities are entitled to, the expectations and standards, the frameworks that integrate general and special education, evidence-based specially designed instruction, how we can better prepare educators and administrators, and the knowledge, skills, and expertise, how to deploy resources and staffing and service delivery models, and then that continuous improvement loop of data collection and monitoring and technical assistance. And we built this really pretty robust picture of what we all agree, I think, is a shared understanding of what the educational experiences of special students with disabilities should look like and the barriers that have prevented us from building it. And funding has come up, you know, repeatedly in those conversations, both as sort of an explicit barrier, we don't have enough funding, but also the way that it limits what we think we can provide. And so, you know, tonight we're just going to talk about what would it take to provide every student with a disability in our state with the services and supports that they're entitled to, and how will we know that the funding is adequate? And we're going to talk about what we're doing now and how we can go from where we are now to this a different future. So, you know, I wanted to just make one more note, which is that, you know, funding policy is pretty complicated, and we don't have to be 50 people who are funding policy experts. We are very lucky to have an actual funding policy expert with us tonight. Tammy Colby is here, and she's going to talk a little bit about the landscape of special education state funding, and we're so thankful that she could be with us. But we all have experience of what inadequate funding means for students. So, you know, tonight I hope we'll just be willing to kind of share what we know and what we see from our own perspectives and think through, based on the reading and the presentations we're going to have, you know, what kind of a course we could set moving forward. So thanks for being here.
Ms. Zogby, you did a great job with your introduction. Without the next slide, you kind of went through it. So Brian? Can you switch? And then will that help? I mean, in terms of the guiding questions, you kind of led through it.
Oh, yep. Sorry, I went right to it, huh? Okay, so those are the guiding questions. Is funding for special education adequate? How can MSDE require the LEAs to use special education funding under the blueprint to supplement and not supplant funding for special education services? And what are the options for short-term funding increases?
So that's my cue. We do have one public comment written that was submitted, and it is from a Mary Ann Williams, and she asked that I read it aloud. So she says, "Good afternoon, all. I thank MSDE and the co-chairs for all of the efforts put forth to coordinate this work group. I have followed it very closely. Thankfully, I no longer have a school-age student. However, it is my duty to continue advocating for others so they can have a better experience and better outcomes than we, as well as many others, are still contending with well into our children's adulthoods. My comments today will briefly touch 4 areas: funding, administration, measurement of success, and programming and implementation. Funding. We supposedly have the money now. Let's actually use it to directly impact students and make it count. Historically, policy has promised federal dollars dedicated to special education. Those promises have been broken year after year. More recently, on a local level, ESSER funds were authorized and distributed, then went somewhere, but I'm not sure where. Transparency and regular updates to the general public are crucial. Administration. The first thing that comes to mind when we mention this aspect of education is overcomplication. In general, I don't have much patience for bureaucracy. I have even less for it when it comes to children. Their lives are passing by while adults try to get it together. Meetings, stats, and endless jargon do not equal action. What does an additional study mean for a little girl in Harford County who has waited 8 months for her first grade year to be assessed for a possible learning disability? What does the dispassionate culture of a school mean for a 10th grader in Baltimore City who is in special ed and has ESL instruction teetering on the edge of giving up on school altogether because he thinks it's not his thing? It took the governor's office to move my own child from a horrific middle school in Prince George's County. Why was that? Being out of touch in a disconnected governmental bubble, lack of common sense, and top-heavy standards of operation deflect and delay decisions that could deliver immediate solutions. We can no longer hide behind COVID. If nothing else, COVID showed us that necessary shifts could be made quickly because of the urgency. We must view the delivery of an answer to this educational reorganization as no less dire. Measurement of success. Hollow stats do not tell the whole story. The stories behind the numbers are the children. Yes, special education students can graduate with a Maryland high school state diploma, but how does that translate to greater society? Can they take honors English in community college because their GPA was inflated? Will they fail the class? The answer is yes and yes. A high school diploma should mean something. This scenario is tantamount to simply passing or pushing kids through. College or career readiness should not be a catchphrase. Programming and implementation. This helps us to segue to the disconnection of transition services. Students with severe and profound physical disabilities have a clearer path. The ones with the invisible disabilities like ADHD or various forms of autism spend the immediate years after high school floundering. Granted, a student's dreams and potential could never be limited. They should never be limited. They have the right to pursue whatever avenue is possible. There was a time when many students were funneled into vocational programs. Votech became a taboo term. The pendulum has swung back in the other direction. It is okay to be in a trade school or certified training program. These future employees are needed to make our local economies function. Because of the way CTE hubs are currently set up, students should be able to choose their program at the end of 8th grade. This would prevent being uprooted after 9th or 10th grade to transfer to a vocational program in their jurisdiction. Additionally, those vocational centers must be staffed with professionals that can address students with special needs. For instance, a student may be well suited to go into a culinary program or plumbing apprenticeship, but they will not have a safe and meaningful experience without support for executive dysfunction or emotional dysregulation. It is understood that IDEA and ADEA part ways after an individual leaves public school. However, there is no reason that the Disability Support Services Office at a local community college and high school special education department do not maintain an ongoing relationship. Maryland Higher Education seems to divorce itself from this conversation, and although not under MSDE, there should be some sort of interface and even accountability. And with that, I will hand the mic back to Ms. Liz highlights from last meeting.
Great. Thanks, Carmen. So last meeting, we talked about staffing and service delivery. Just to refresh your memory, we talked about how, where, and by whom special education and related services are delivered to students with disabilities. So you provided feedback on staffing plans, on possible standards for things like class sizes, group sizes, provider-student ratios, workload, models of service delivery, and paraprofessionals. And throughout, we thought about what kinds of standards and guidance MSDE could provide to local education agencies. So, the feedback that we got, we distilled and we sent back to you. In staffing plans, you responded that MSDE should gather evidence-based standards for LEAs to use as they develop those staffing plans, that there should be guidance on how LEAs should adapt if they can't fully meet the standards, that the process for developing those staffing plans should be more transparent. There were ideas like standing advisory boards to provide input, that LEAs should maintain staffing pools, and that the staffing plan should include more information about vacancies and what LEAs will do to provide FAPE if there are vacancies. And then finally, that staffing plan should include a discussion of student outcomes and how the new plan for each year will lead to improved student outcomes. You gave lots of examples of standards for service delivery. I'm not going to go through all of those, but you've been sent that document, all kinds of ideas that folks came up with. The basic idea within standards was that there should be baseline standards for teacher staff to student ratios in different service delivery models, and that staffing should be based on student needs and not what can be afforded, what LEAs can afford. And that there should be more guidance on evidence-based collaborative instructional models, and that the role of the IEP chair should be better defined. And then the last bucket was of feedback was around paraprofessionals, and that MSDE should develop standards for paraprofessionals, their qualifications, training, career path models, guidance around determining when a one-to-one aid is an appropriate support for a student, and what the appropriate role and tasks for paraprofessionals should be. Robust training for paraprofessionals in a variety of areas that people talked about, and then also training for teachers on supervising and the appropriate roles for paraprofessionals. So that led to this recommendation, which was sent out, and maybe we'll just read it really quickly, and then people can provide any thoughts about it. So MSDE should develop a plan for a plan with specific tasks and timelines within 60 days to set evidence-based baseline standards for staffing and service delivery with mechanisms for flexibility with justification, emphasizing a focus on student needs, not financial constraints, and developed with consideration of the specific ideas generated by the work group, many of which I just read to you. The plan should include updating guidance for LEA development of staffing plans, with that emphasis on transparency, vacancy reporting, and that connection to improve student outcomes. Standards for teacher staff to student ratios for different service delivery models. Baseline standards for workloads including the use of blueprint required non-instructional time, standards for the role of the IEP chair, and standards for paraprofessionals and one-to-one aides. So we did not receive any written feedback on this proposed recommendation. So I open the floor to whoever has a thought about it.
Hi, this is Betsy Perry. I apologize. I'm in my car. I'm a special education teacher in Montgomery County. I definitely need some more time to digest what the recommendations were. And I just have a couple of questions / comments. So one of the issues with, I agree with all of the bullets for paraprofessionals. I think they're underutilized and can be used more effectively to support student outcome. However, when I look on careers and look at the positions, and there are many that are open for some of the paraeducators, they have switched from being like permanent to temporary. The problem with that is they don't have benefits. So we're talking trying to attract people to a job that's extremely low paying, and you could possibly, in some situations, a lot of these are one-to-one or positions where they could be working with students that can be challenging. And so we're looking at salaries that are not competitive, and on top of that, no benefits, and it's really hard to maintain that. We had someone at our school last year who was a one-to-one, again, no, it was itinerant, and they quit. So just something for consideration. And I'd like to also add the importance of paraeducators getting trained. I literally just had a conversation with a school psychologist today about that, how they can really be used more effectively to help run intervention groups and do more supplemental teaching and support for students who need that extra help. But unfortunately, we're dealing with the realistic look that we're in the middle of a humongous teacher shortage crisis and paraeducation crisis. And I know that this is the ideal place we want to be. However, are there any thoughts, discussions, or support to address some of those needs? Because we can make this wonderful, great plan, but if there's no one here to do the work, you know, what is the impact? Is there a plan B or a way to come up with different types of plans to help support and keep the momentum going so that our kids get what they need? Thank you.
Thanks, Ms. Perry.
I have a question, Liz. This is David Stone.
Sure.
With these, I was wondering with the recommendations, how many of these are currently in place now? I mean, they seem like the kinds of things that might have been recommended previously. And I'm just wondering, A, if any of them are in effect now, and B, if there's any data that would support either continuing them or expanding them.
You mean elements of this recommendation that are already in existence? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think the idea here is that many of the things that are mentioned in this recommendation are things that, so for instance, thinking about the staffing plans, there is a review guide that MSDE has put out that goes to LEAs to help them develop their staffing plans. And it says that the staffing plan should include, for instance, vacancies, or that they should talk about student outcomes. But the issue is that isn't actually happening. So the question is, could our recommendation propel a firmer plan for MSDE to communicate to LEAs, this is really what the staffing plan needs to look like, and provide them with the support to make sure that that actually happens. So it's not that these things are all new, I guess but many of them maybe could be bolstered.
So is the idea that these strategies currently exist at MSDE, they're just not, it just needs a better way to either enforce or monitor them, or are there new
Some
Right.
of them, and some of them are new, I would say. I mean, I could let Dr. Collins and Dr. Hickman respond to that, but also I think the idea of baseline standards is a kind of the model that we've been working with, the framework we've been working with a little bit, and that I think is a bit of a change.
Thanks.
think what you, if you don't mind, I think what you've captured or said, Mr. Stone, is yes, there are things that are in place, but the changes from the recommendations, such as the first one says, updating the guidance. There is guidance on the staffing plans. They do want enhanced emphasis on the process and on vacancy reporting. Those things are collected, but I think that the recommendation is for them to be communicated better, to be monitored, and for more accountability. In terms of standards for teacher staff to student ratios, the expectation or the request is that we, MSD, create a standard and hold schools accountable for following it or not. And there are concerns about making that a matter of fact standard or requirement in holding folks accountable. The same for baseline standards for the teacher-related service providers. What we've been doing is using best practice, making recommendations, and providing guidance on how to do that and how to serve your students and meet their needs. But the recommendations from the work group are more towards a standard accountability and just maintaining and mandating some of those things that MSD may not be able to do legally. Did I answer your question, sir?
Yes, thanks. Sorry, I was muted. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Liz, it's Diane McGowan. I was just going to expand on that and speak to the standards for the role of IEP chair. While many jurisdictions have a job description for such a position within their LEAs, I think the roles and responsibilities and the level of oversight of that position varies from LEA to LEA. For example, in Anne Arundel County, we don't really have a designated position as such at our elementary levels, but we have an IEP facilitator position at our secondary schools. That is the equivalent of a Unit 1 teaching position, where when I was formerly in Baltimore County, all assistant principals held the role of IEP chair. So there was a higher level of oversight and evaluative quality to that position. And then you get over to the Eastern Shore counties, where many of the elementary schools don't even have assistant principals. So I think that expectation varies across the state. And so having a standard for what that role is and what level of oversight that the state is expecting, I think could be a good thing for our state moving forward.
Thanks.
This is
Cool.
hi, this is Imani. I haven't been on a meeting in a while, but I just to kind of give a framework of my background. So I'm a child care provider. I'm on an early childhood advisory council, and the recommendations I think are great. And when we look at the blueprint in Pillar 1 specifically, there's nobody who's really dealing with the early education for before K-12. And so a lot of these things, when you look at it, this is fitting for a school system. But when we look at what the blueprint is looking at in pre-K 3 and pre-K 4, there are going to be places where those pre-Ks may be provided by community providers. And if that is the case, then how does this type of recommendation and guidance, which is very much needed, the standards are needed, very much flow into the areas of early learning? Because I can tell you it's not being talked a whole lot about in Pillar 1 at this point. That's where it also needs to be talked about, but it does need to be considered here, because we do get children as early as 2 or before with special needs and issues going on. And it's very imperative that even our staffing and the services and through infants and toddlers or whatever's going to happen, that we have a better grip on what we need to do to help the students, even in the community settings, and especially those who may be providers under the blueprint with pre-K 3 and pre-K 4. So it's really just a comment about how do we look at this and make it to the place where it does impact and get to the community providers, including Head Start, that have served children with special needs and getting them the services that they need and proper support. Because even sometimes I can see there are places where we could use a one-on-one aid in a childcare setting. And again, if we get them now, before they are in K-12, maybe we can help prevent a lot of the need for what happens from K-12 and up. Not all of it, but there's a lot of room for us to do a lot of work in that space.
You don't mind. Thank you, Ms. Rose, for speaking to that. And although this particular recommendation may not directly speak to that, this goes in alignment with the conversation that we had with the state board last week in reference to what our imperatives are. Early childhood is one, and the focus on working with our providers in the community and our community providers, which we do daily. We do have to provide some in-service and training and making sure that we do assist them in how to best meet our students. We all agree that early intervention is the key because we want those students to progress, receive what they need, and possibly not enter the school needing special education services. So we will take your concern into consideration. And I do believe that some of the other recommendations do touch on that, but that is work that's ongoing as we speak.
And we will also, Imani, have a session focused entirely on early childhood. We just haven't gotten to it yet, but thanks for raising that. Okay, I'm feeling a little concerned about the time. Do we have any suggestions or concerns about this recommendation or specific changes that folks want to make to it? It sounds like I'm hearing a lot of assent about a number of the pieces here.
Hi there, this is Bess Cropper in Worcester.
Hi.
Hey there. I have two thoughts about the recommendations. The first thing I wanted to say, I agree with the standards for IEP chairs, but want to kind of second what Diane McGowan said. IEP chairs look very different across the state. Like here in Worcester, our special education teachers are the IEP chairs. So again, I think it would be great to have standards, but again, also keeping that in mind that that position is very different across the state.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, the standards for paraprofessionals, and these are all wonderful things, but they are historically very low paid paraprofessionals. They're very low paid. So maybe adding a standard for pay, and I know that's probably a no-go, but it's just, I'm throwing it out there because if you add all of these qualifications and training that are required, but then pay them minimum wage, it doesn't compare to what they're being asked to do. So just a thought.
Thanks. That's great. And that was something that came up in the specific feedback was around career paths and also increasing pay. Leslie? Oh, I'm sorry. I see a few people have raised their hands, so maybe we'll go with that.
Yeah, so thank you. For those of us who have been around the block on these issues for a very, very long time, I really appreciate these recommendations. And I just want to focus on a couple of things. One, the staffing ratios. In the very, very old days, Comar had a requirement for maximum class size averages, which then disappeared from the regs. And they weren't particularly helpful. You could have a class of 1 and a class of 30, and your average would be 15. But in the absence of that, it's left districts sort of all over the place on how to staff. And some years ago, the Commission on Equity and Excellence in Education addressed this issue and had a lot of discussion about the fact that, you know, a special ed teacher is not a special ed teacher, is not a special ed teacher, right? Some of them are co-teaching, some of them are in separate classrooms, some of them are providing consultative services, related service providers as well. And so we had a lot of discussion about that. And I appreciate that there's now, you know, a plan for a plan, but I also feel a sense of urgency about if a plan is developed or a plan for a plan is developed, that the implementation needs to happen, right? That's the accountability piece. And I really want to make sure that we are engaging in work that's going to actually result in change for kids. I also, I mean, I do think standards are important for IEP chairs training. I mean, all of this is really important. I just want to make sure that we take it to the actual implementation level and that what we do doesn't become yet another report that sits on a shelf.
Thanks,
Mr.
Leslie.
Garner. Thank you. I think Mr. Garner had his hand raised too.
Yeah, I'll make this brief. I just wanted to ensure that as the recommendations are looked at, that our higher education institutions are brought into that conversation. I feel if the local LEAs and MSDE is looking to requiring more standards that are higher caliber, for lack of a better word, I am wondering if the local institutions of higher education from junior college levels with the lower level 100 and 200 classes to university, that they're part of this conversation. One thing that we're doing in Washington County is we have an accelerant program for the year where student teachers, for lack of a better word, spend the entire year. So regardless of their job, they've learned their job inside and out by the very end. I'm wondering if that could be part of the standardization that maybe the higher universities and the university system across Maryland could also be part of that conversation, because I feel like we have kids that, or when I say kids, young adults in college, learning on the job is the best way to do it. If we had a standardization, those people are that much more prepared when they graduate. So that's my 2 cents.
Thank you.
I don't see any other hands, and I think you read the comments to yourself. You've agreed that those who have spoken are in agreement with the recommendation. You want to go with in the rest of the time? You want to ask for any opposition? Ms. Ogden, I don't hear you if you're talking.
Nope, that sounds good. I feel it sounds like people are in agreement, and I think we'll go ahead and move forward, understanding that people can bring back, additional feedback as time goes on. Okay, thank you for that great discussion, and we will move to Tammy Colby. You're going to introduce her, Dr. Hickman?
I will, but I do want to recognize one thing. I see a message from Senator Karen Lewis Young in reference to concerns about the phrase with the focus on student needs, not financial constraints. And it's your question, is that realistic? That is, it's idealistic, but we're going to look at how to prioritize and really rationalize the recommendations, getting to the fact that I think, like Ms. Margolis said, to implementation. So what can we do? But we will be prioritizing the recommendations over time. So I hope that helps.
And I think also the conversation tonight, which is going to be around ensuring that we have adequate funding, because as we've laid out, the law requires us to enable students to meet grade level standards and do it through evidence-based practices. So that's already what we're required to do. So we need to figure out a way to make sure that we are writing IEPs that are based on student needs, not based on financial limits. And hopefully our conversation tonight is going to set us on a course to ensure that we have adequate funding for students.
Awesome. So with that being said, yes, we'll move on to, based on this conversation, we thought that was important, not only to have a pre-reading, and you received a pre-reading and an addendum to that as well, but we also wanted to bring in an expert to share with you what's going on across the country, across the nation in terms of funding for programs in special education. So as you can see from the slide, Dr. Tammy Colby is a principal researcher at the American Institute for Research, where she leads research and policy analysis related to federal and state special education funding policy and pre-K through 16 education finance generally. She has worked with states to evaluate and redesign their existing special education funding policies and currently serves as the principal investigator for the U.S. Department of Education's National Study of Special Education Spending. At this time, Dr. Colby, we welcome you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come before all of you to talk a little bit about funding special education. As I understand it, I'm part of a two-act play tonight. I'm going to provide sort of an overview of sort of the general landscape nationally about how we fund states fund special education. And my good colleague, Nate Levinson, is going to come in as act number 2 in this play to talk more specifically about Maryland's approach. And then we'll both be available to sort of answer more specific questions and engage in discussion around ideas you might have with respect to sort of Maryland's approach to funding special education and also potential reforms. But really my goal in sort of the next few minutes is to level set and just give you a sense of sort of what the existing systems look like nationally. What are the sort of some of the rules of the road that come from federal guidelines? What other states do and what they don't do? And then also to sort of offer a framework that you might use for thinking about how you might develop your own or think about revising what you have for a special education policy. So again, I'm going to talk a little bit of setting the stage. I'm going to talk about the national policy land curve, and then I'm going to ask for input on next steps. Okay, so for setting the stage, next slide, please. So I think it's important for us to zoom out here a little bit and understand sort of what the federal requirements are for state funding. I think the big thing to understand is that there is no requirement technically by the federal government that any state provide funding for special education. However, states are required to have sort of engage in maintenance of financial support, which means that you have to make available at least the same amount of state financial support from one year to the next for educating children with disabilities. So if you were a state that never provided any funding or a state that provided minimal funding, then your only obligation under federal law is to continue at that. Federal requirements do not stipulate how states distribute aid among LEAs, state funding that is. Instead, you're bound to maintain sort of this aggregate level of financial support across entities, which means that states have a lot of flexibility in modifying how you distribute aid among your LEAs. And you have more flexibility in how you distribute than you have in reducing the total amount of state spending. So that's sort of the first rule of the road. The second thing, if you want to go down, next slide, to keep in mind is you do need to sort of keep into account this other requirement under IDA, that your state funding mechanism cannot result in placements that violate federal requirements for serving children with disabilities in a least restrictive environment. What does that really operationally mean? It means that a state can't put in place a funding mechanism by which you distribute dollars based on the type of setting in which a child is served, if in fact by doing so, that results in failure to provide a child with FAPE according to the unique needs of a child. Why is this here? That was added sort of at the last reauthorization because there were some state funding formulas where there were concerns that how aid was being distributed based on where a child was placed might be disincentivizing or incentivizing certain kinds of placements that worked against the best interests of the child. So two kind of big sort of requirements from the federal government. You can't go below what you spent the year before in terms of state funding, and your funding, but you have a lot of flexibility in how you distribute state funding. And you also cannot have a funding formula that results in sort of FAPE being violated, particularly with regard to the type of setting in which a child is served. So then we go on slide 6. So then what happens, right? If you don't have real strict guidelines from the federal government, other than sort of those two parameters, it means you have a lot of flexibility in how you develop your funding programs. And in fact, what it means is we have 50 different state approaches to funding special education. No state does it the same way. But what we can see when we look across states is there are some commonalities in terms of building blocks for how their funding formula work or funding policies work. So the first building block is with respect to how states actually determine their funding obligations, like what their appropriation should be. Most states build up from the bottom up. And what does that mean? That means they have a formula that determines sort of how much money should be spent and be allocated to LEAs. And so that's how the appropriation is determined. There are a few states where it's top down, where they say, we have this amount of money and this is all we're going to spend, and then they distribute that money out. Again, most states build from the bottom up, but there are a few that have top down. Next slide. So when you build from the bottom up in particular, we then think about, well, how are state aid amounts calculated for LEAs? Like, how much do we give to Montgomery County, right? Or how much do we give to Anne Arundel County? And the state funding formula generally are comprised of two parts in making that determination: a basis on which the funding is calculated, and then there are these different mechanisms that determine the amounts of funds generated by the formula. We oftentimes talk more about the mechanisms. This is where we talk about like weights, for example, or grants. But the basis is really important, and it's oftentimes overlooked, and it's an important consideration that we have to keep in mind. So if we want to go on to the next slide, we can think about sort of the three different bases for funding. We can base the funding that an LEA receives from the state on the student count, right? Which is the number of students with disabilities they have in the LEA, or maybe even the count of all students. For example, if we had something called a census-based funding formula, which I'll talk about in a moment, maybe we base the funding on the total number of students in the LEA, not just the number of students with disabilities. It also could be that some states use resource ratios, right, which are oftentimes student to staff ratios to determine, so as the basis of their funding, right? And so how does that work? They say, well, we make an assumption that
for a 5:30 meeting.
Hello. Is everything okay? Okay. Where the resource ratios make us sort of allocate dollars based on certain assumptions about the number of teachers per student or students per teacher. And then the third way is expenditures, which is actual allowable spending, right, is the basis of funding. And when we have expenditures, those are generally cost reimbursement models where an LEA is reimbursed for a certain percentage of their costs. But for student count, where we have where the basis for the funding is either the number of students with disabilities or all students, that's where we see the pupil weights, which is, as Nate will talk about in a minute, which is how Maryland has their funding formula structured right now, or some sort of fixed dollar grant per student. Usually when we have resource ratios, they are some fixed dollar grant or some instructional unit. But as you can see from this table, there are a lot of different ways to mix and match. And so again, remember that the constraint on the state is, from the federal government's perspective, is you need to stay at or above your existing total funding, but you have a lot of options with respect to how you distribute funding. And these are the basic component parts that you have. In addition, many states incorporate two other design elements. One is contingency funding for high-cost students. And this is sort of what we call risk pool or a high-cost kid program or student program. And what that program does is it reimburses districts at some percentage for extraordinary expenses over and above some benchmark for students who are high need and high cost. And so if you think about it, if you're an LEA and you have a student for whom the IEP calls for $100,000 in services, that's the kind of, this fund would step in and provide the district with supplemental funding over and above sort of the normal state aid, the typical state aid that they would receive for that student, special education services. The other design element that some states have put in place is a cap on state funding, usually tied to special education enrollment or identification rates. There are a lot of questions about whether or not that's an equitable policy in terms of the research literature. So let me go on to the next slide. So we have all these building blocks. So then the question is, well, how do states put all these building blocks together to create their formula? And as I said before, there are essentially 50 different formulas. but we can kind of group them here according to sort of the most common mechanisms. And so what you see is that we have 8 states that use single weights. That's what Maryland uses currently. We have 15 states that use multiple weights. 9 states use fixed dollar grants. That is, they allocate a certain dollar amount rather than a weight that's applied or a multiplier that's applied to some base. We have tiered grants, which they provide different fixed dollar amounts, maybe based on differences in student need or disability categories. We have some states that don't have a special education allocation, a separate set of special education allocation at all. It's embedded in their general education foundation aid amount. We have 6 states that actually just reimburse an LEA for some percentage of their spending. We have a few states that we call hybrid states, which are sort of mishmash of different things. And then we have 12 states that do have enrollment caps, and enrollment caps in this context means over LEAs that have over a certain percentage of students with disabilities. For each student who's over that cap, the LEA receives no additional funding from the state. So let's look at a minute about sort of states use single weights. I thought this might be interesting for you all to see, particularly in the context of Maryland, right? So states use single weights. These, again, single weights are applied to some base, right? Some base adequacy number usually, and it's a multiplier. And you can see that they're all very different. And I think that's the really big takeaway here is that, the single weights, and we'll see in the multiple weights too, that the weights really vary across states. And they vary not just in terms of the magnitude of the weight, but also you have to remember that these are all applied to different base spending amounts. So single weights, right, when we compare weights across states, we have to take into account not just the fact the multiplier is different, we have to take into account the fact that the multiplier is applied to different base. So hypothetically, a district in Louisiana where the weight is 1.5 and a district in Alabama where the weight was 1.5, they actually receive very different amounts of money per student to offset the cost of special education, providing special education services. For states that use multiple weights, most states that use multiple weights adjust for cost differences associated with serving students with disabilities with different needs. And if you think about that, makes sense, right? Because when you have one weight, you're assuming, right, that one weight is going to provide equitable funding for all students with disabilities, right? But yet we know that single weight is never going to be quite right for any one student. There are going to be students who cost more than sort of the assumed amount that goes underneath the weight, that goes with the weight, and there'll be students that cost less. And so the policy assumption is that the distribution of students with disabilities and their needs is relatively the same across districts, and so that's all sort of evens out. Well, that oftentimes is not the case. And we can think of there for a lot of good reasons that might not be the case. And so lots of states have moved, more states have moved over time to using multiple weights. Washington State is the only state that uses a smaller weight for students who spend time outside general education settings, and that's actually an important thing because they're likely going to get in trouble with that with the federal government underneath sort of the rules I talked to you about before. That's why I pulled that out. But other states assign different weights according to disability category, groups of disability categories, the number of hours per week of specialized services, high versus low cost services, where a student is placed for services within a district, presuming that placement is tied in that case to cost, and whether a student is placed out of district. Then we have the states with enrollment caps. You can see that these enrollment caps vary quite a bit. There has been research in North Carolina recently that suggests that enrollment caps introduce equity concerns because places that have there are LEAs that have, just by virtue of their population, higher percentage of students with requiring special education services, and so the enrollment cap penalizes them unnecessarily so. Then we have safety net funding, and again, this is the high cost kid or high cost reimbursement program. Maryland is one of the few states that does not have a high cost student program or safety net funding program. We can see that most states operate one. Some states have them so that it's a reimbursement. Other states, a few states have them so they operate, so the threshold is $1 threshold. And the others, some states use them as a per pupil spending multiplier for eligibility. So moving forward, there was a lot of information about what states do, but I think sort of what I'd like to sort of end the conversation tonight on is what are some of the design considerations that you might be keeping in mind as the conversation of Maryland moves forward? We can go to the next slide. And I usually try to think about this in 3 ways: equity, efficiency, and alignment. And so when you're thinking about evaluating your existing formula and also thinking about potential redesigns of the formula, I think there are some important questions. And the first one is, does the funding formula drive supplemental state special education funding to where there is most need? And 2, do localities that have less ability to pay, for example, limited tax capacity or the ability to raise additional revenues for special education, do their capacity overall, are we driving dollars to those places? And why would that second point be an important consideration? It's an important consideration because there's always a local share. The state, neither the state nor the federal government pay for all of special education costs. And so there's always a local share. And if those local dollars are more expensive or harder to come by in certain localities, that raises real equity concerns with regard to funding special education. The second thing is efficiency. And that is, does the formula distribute state funding in a way that minimizes state and local burden? Is it simple and transparent to administer? Right? So for example, reimbursement formulas, sometimes those are viewed as fairly burdensome, right? Like we need to check all the invoices. We've got to check for allowable costs. It also is the case that some formula can be really, really complicated. Vermont's is very complicated. And so the idea that it's simple and transparent to administer also is a priority. And then third, I think this is a really important consideration to keep in mind is the formula aligned with the state's policy priorities for special education policy and practice? Money should always be the means, not the ends, right? And we want to allocate enough dollars, but also distribute those dollars in a way that are aligned with our other priorities. So we want to make sure that we're driving dollars to the places that most need them. We want to make sure that we have adequate funding going to the places, right, to everyone. We also want to make sure that the way that we're allocating dollars aren't incentivizing practices and programs that are inconsistent with the state's goals, for example, around LRE. And we also want to make sure that they're well aligned with things we're trying to incentivize, for example, early identification. So just a few big thoughts there, I think, and those are the end of my slides. I think, am I turning this over to Nate now?
Yes.
Yes.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you very much, Tammy. So where Tammy gave us all, I think, a really thoughtful overview of the way 50 states are funding special education, I'm going to take just a few minutes to give a brief overview of how one of those 50 states does it, the one we all care about most today. Wanted to just acknowledge so there's great clarity that as the Special Education Working Group, part of our charge is to have this discussion and ultimately make recommendations as to whether we think the state is providing sufficient funds to meet the needs of students with disabilities. So this is part of our job, and that's why we're having the discussion today. Brian, next slide. As Tammy shared, and Brian, you can click a couple times, right? Stop there. As Tammy shared, different models, the Maryland model is one of those formulas. It is a single weight formula, and there are 3 numbers that go into the formula. One is the special education weight. It's a number that some other number gets multiplied by. The foundation program cost, which is the funding for the average student without special needs. And then that average student without special needs, that amount would get multiplied by the special education weight, where at least in theory, that would cover the additional cost for a student's special needs. And all of that is based on the number of students. That's that census that Tammy talked about, but it is the number of students with disabilities as of October of the prior year. So that's the basic formula. I'll give you a quick, simple example. Brian, next slide. So let us assume for a moment, just to make my math small, the number small, we've got 325 students with special needs. The current special education weight is 0.99, and the foundation program cost, that is the average cost of educating a student in Maryland without special needs, is $8,789. So if you want to figure out how much money an LEA is going to get, this LEA, it's that 0.99 times the 8,700 times the 325 students, and that says you get $2.8 million. It is a relatively simple and straightforward formula. Obviously, the conversation tonight and the discussions, are these the right numbers and it is the right formula? But it's a relatively straightforward formula. There are a couple other considerations. As Tammy again shared, there's a lot of latitude that each state can have on how they set their rules. So one of the additional rules in Maryland that said, hey, as a LEA, we're going to send you $2.8 million. But now as an LEA, the state is weighing in to say, and where should those dollars go on a school-by-school basis? Because the federal government doesn't have a rule as to how much each individual school would get. So the state of Maryland has added a rule that said, hey, 75% of that 2.8 million should follow the student to their school. And the theory behind that was you wanted to make sure that the schools that had more kids with special needs got more of the dollars. Arguably not a crazy thought, but as we said, it's a simple single weight formula. And that not so perhaps crazy thought can create some real concerns. And one of the concerns is that imagine a school that did not have a lot of students with special needs, but they had a lot of students with very significant special needs. The formula didn't give more money to the kids with very significant and therefore costly to serve special needs. So that school would not necessarily be entitled to a larger share of these dollars. So there is definitely concern that the 75% rule could under or overfund schools if their the number of students with disabilities were some had far more or far fewer kids with significant needs. Next slide, Brian. Special education funding, thank you, isn't just the only funding obviously going to a school or to a district. The blueprint, I use the phrase a layer cake. So obviously every district gets a certain amount of money for every student. And then through that formula, there was additional money for students with special needs. Then there are also additional weights and therefore additional dollars for multilingual learners or economically disadvantaged students. So an LEA would get money for different reasons and based on the types of students and number of students they have. I think really important to remember though, it was never the intention that these additional weights would somehow offset inadequacy of special education funding or supplement special education supports. They were intended to help in other ways. Next slide. There's been a lot of debate over using a single weight. And as Tammy shared, it's not only, I think it was 8 of the systems states are doing it. There seems to be a movement away from that. And certainly the Kerwin Commission, when they looked at this, believed there should be differentiated weights based on the severity of student disabilities. So disabilities that generally require far more services would generate much higher levels of funding. There have been a number of studies that have looked at tiered models. One recommended the current single weight model. The other recommended a differentiated weight. And I think one of the pieces, and I really appreciate one of the charts Tammy shared, was how even folks who have a single weight seem to have very different numbers for those weights. And I think sometimes folks assume that there is incredible detailed calculations, thoughts, and analysis that generates each of those weights. And I'm sure there's a lot of thought and a lot of discussion, but to be clear that in the case of Maryland, when the weight was set, currently 0.99, there is no direct reference that said, hey, we have calculated how much it would cost to serve all the kids with special needs adequately. And when we did that, 0.99 gets us to exactly where we wanted to be. Certainly the weight was discussed, different numbers were considered, but I think it's important to know that there was no deeply reviewed assumption for what would it cost to provide all the services that perhaps people think kids need when that weight was set. Next one, please. If you advance. So there are also a few things that were not directly considered and a few other things to keep in mind. This is more of some of the details. One is that transportation costs and non-public special education placements did not get as much discussion, or the formula didn't directly take those into account. There is funding for $1,000 for disabled students. There is a number of rules around funding non-public special education school placements around the programs need to be first approved. The Teacher Pay Parity Act said over time the teachers working there have to have pay similar to public school staff. There's definitely a split between the state and the LEAs. Wanted to note that currently about 14% of all special education expenditures are going to these schools. And again, to remind folks, as Tammy shared, Maryland is one of the few states that does not have a specific plan or program or reimbursement model that says, hey, if I'm a LEA that has more of these non-public special education placements or other, even in-district, very high-cost students, there isn't a special arrangement for systems that do have more high-cost students in or out of district. And lastly, the three other issues just wanted to put on the table, particularly as we go into our conversations. The first is adequacy. That's one of the first questions of our guiding questions. There seems to be overwhelming evidence acknowledged by the Kerwin Commission that special education is significantly underfunded. Certainly, we're not seeing the results we would want. And also that an acceptable study of what is adequate funding is necessary. There have been earlier studies for determining what, quote, is adequate, and they have been widely considered to be unacceptable studies, which also highlights that it is a complicated thing to calculate. The second big issue, again, one of our guiding questions for today, is the issue of supplementation versus supplantation. Say that 3 times fast. And this is where money has been allocated by formula for special education services. There's not a system in place to make sure that LEAs are actually using all that money for special education services. And lastly, on what the budgeting and accounting side of things, the current budgeting and accounting systems don't actually make it easy for an LEA or the state to actually know the full cost of what we're spending on students with special needs, and nor is it easy to know what it would cost to do everything we want or think should be done. So that there is there's not a great fact base being collected or generated, which makes all of this conversation more complicated. And I think that is a quick walk through of the current approach to funding in Maryland and some comparison to how it is done elsewhere. I want to note that we've had a great conversation, particularly about the recommendation, but that has put us about 15 minutes or so behind schedule. So I will ask Liz, as co-chair, do you want to throw questions to me and Tammy, or does it make more sense to get into the discussion groups? That's why you get to be in charge. You get to make
Oh my gosh. I don't know. I think
Liz, can I throw
yeah,
something in?
please,
If you don't
Dr.
mind. If you don't mind. I'm looking at the clock. It looks like it's, I don't know, this clock I have is 5:10. Do you think we can go into the group for 20 minutes, come back out, and have the large group discussion and finish up?
I want to say if anybody has a specific question for Tammy, for Dr. Colby, we want to do that first, just so that she doesn't have to necessarily stick around for the entirety of the meeting. Does anybody have a specific question for Dr. Colby?
I had a clarifying question just in terms of the presentation. This is David Stone. In the presentation, I heard that it said non-public schools are 14% of the state budget, and I do see that there's some clarifications in the chat, but that doesn't include all the local expenditures, which is far greater than the state expenditures. So I just felt that was a little bit skewed. It's a much smaller total expenditure throughout the state. It seems
Right,
like
that 14% figure is just based on, if you look at how much we spend overall as a state, just the state dollars.
Right.
That is how much is accounted for non-public placements.
Right. The LEAs though spend the preponderance of funds on those.
Certainly. And that I think is detailed in the I think that's detailed in the pre-reading, how that state and local share piece works.
It is. Yes, thanks.
Yeah. And there's a question from Dr. Badawi. Do we have any data comparing outcomes for children in states that use different funding models? Dr. Colby, do you have a sense of that, or?
No, the answer is no. And it's really difficult to do that because state funding oftentimes makes up just a small share of the total funding available for a child with a disability. We do have some nascent evidence that suggests in some instances where funding formula may have motivational effects to identify a child or identify a child for a particular disability category. But all in all, even in those studies where we have where we see some motivational effects, it's usually at the margin, right? It's not a large number of students where that happens. Some cases, with respect to placement, for example, I did a study years ago around New Jersey's tiered model and some of the policies they had for funding students for external placements. It was pretty clear that the funding formula was incentivizing students being placed out of district. So I think those are the places where we see, but in terms of outcomes, we don't have any good research on that around particular funding models, both because state funding oftentimes is just is always a piece of the puzzle. And two, we also don't have good outcome measures, right? And so it makes it really difficult to do that. I think the question that we need to ask ourselves, though, obviously outcomes are very important and should be our top priority, right? For students with for all students. we can think about like intermediate outcomes if you think about a logic model, right? And so two of the things that we oftentimes do want to make sure that doesn't happen is we want to make sure that funding formula, again, are the means, not the ends, and that money doesn't get in the way of appropriate identification, appropriate services on a child's IEP, and the students' access to those services, right? So we want to make sure that children are appropriately identified, that their IEPs have the full range of services to which they're entitled. They're going to help them make the kind of progress that we would hope that they would make. And also, we want to make sure that money doesn't get in the way of an LEA actually delivering on the promise of the services that are identified in the IEP.
And just, I see a comment from Leslie in the chat, and I think it covers this topic of the weights. And if there's a weight for X, Y, or Z, it seems human nature or incentive to do more of X, Y, or Z if the weight is there. And again, as Tammy shared, there have been some studies on the edges, but it's very weird. I've worked in 30 states now. And the folks sitting around the IEP team that really are driving a huge portion of these decisions, they have no idea what the weights are. And it's just, I have been surprised after 20 years of 30 states, how little the IEP teams are influenced this. I will say the one exception I've seen, is in states that have significant reimbursement for very costly programs, there is more comfort in thinking, hey, this is not going to be so detrimental to the district's finances. But even there, when there isn't that kind of reimbursement, I don't want to underestimate I think the weights help bring to equity that folks who need more money, given the kids they're serving, get more money. But I've just not seen the huge kind of swings or even the small kind of swings. Just another example where they've capped it. So I've worked in Oregon where they cap, when you have over 11% of your kids identified, you get 0. It just hasn't stopped most of the schools I've worked with there saying, oh, we're at 11, we need to start thinking differently. Don't want to say incentives don't matter, but I think sometimes in this conversation, people assume they drive a lot of behavior. I think they drive a lot of equity.
Yeah, I agree with Nate. I think that we make big assumptions about the extent to which different distribution mechanisms, right, in these formula drive decisions at a local level. It's not the distribution mechanism. What the research shows is that, and for folks who've been around schools, money's fungible, right? Like, it's what really drives decision making is just the amount of money that's available overall, right? So no one's thinking about, the weight, right? Because on the margin, you might generate another $2,000 or $3,000 for a particular student. The issue is when you are chronically underfunded, right? It drives decision-making in perverse ways, right? Rationing of access to special education, which is not permitted under federal law, or it drives more general culture around the kinds of services and the extent to which you might, right? The generosity, I guess you could say, in the services that are on IEP. It also is the case that we know that decisions, I'm seeing out of district placements here. We also know that decisions about out of district placements are driven by a lot of different things. And some of that is culture within a school, right? And preferences for how local school districts choose to serve students with certain needs. And money plays a much smaller role in that than sort of culture and existing systems and practices. And what we find is that, for example, a study we're doing in another state right now, where we're really working to try to sort of help the state move in a different direction with regard to placing students in least restrictive environments. When we got into interviews in schools and districts, it's not the money. In fact, there's probably spending more money to send children out of district. What the issue is it's the perception, it's the understanding, it's the capacity of the local school district to actually serve those students. And a lot of that is really grounded in the system itself within the district. Nate, does that check out? I'm sure that checks out with the work.
Yeah, I mean, just two quick examples where we've done studies within a state, meaning everybody has the same rules for reimbursement. Looking at districts that are the similar size, similar demographics. Some will have 3 or 4 times as many students out of district. But their funding is identical. It is, as Tammy said, it is the culture. It's like, this kid, oh, we could definitely do that. Move to another district. Oh, this student we could never educate inside our own district. And it's not size of district. We've seen big districts and small districts have entirely different profiles. I really do think it is the culture so much more than the funding.
Can I interrupt you real quickly just to
Sure.
say that, you know, next month we're going to talk about the least restrictive environment, and we're going to look real closely at the data, district to district across our state.
Yep.
And we're going to see exactly that kind of variability for sure.
And I think with that, we should probably get into the small groups or we're going to run out of time and I'll be a bad facilitator.
Do you want to just make the last point that money matters, right? But money matters. It's the total amount of money that's available in the school district. And so what we find in our research that matters more than the incremental dollars you might get from state funding, it's the amount of general education dollars that you have to spend. And if you think about it, that makes sense because there's very few cases in this world where there isn't a local responsibility for paying for special education services. So if you are already constrained and your unrestricted dollars that are for your general education program, identifying one more child for special education eats into those already constrained dollars. And those already constrained dollars are the local share of paying for the special education services. And so money matters, but sometimes we focus solely just on the special education funding and the mechanisms by which it comes, rather than looking at the total package of whether or not there are adequate dollars in a school district to start with, right? And that's adequate dollars to serve all students and meet all students' needs. And when a district has inadequate dollars to start with, that's where we see the challenges with identification, placement, service delivery. And so I make that point because I think we have to think about this more holistically than just incremental changes to the special education funding form. I hope that's helpful.
It is.
Great. So thanks so much, Tammy. It's super helpful. We're going to move into the small groups. I think we can do that for 20 minutes, given the amount of time we've got. Because I do want to make sure we get the time to share out as well. You can see on the screen 6 questions. Again, I would say jump to the question or questions that resonate most with you. Let's not do them sequentially, given we've got about 20 minutes. But along those lines of, is funding adequate? Do single or multiple wakes make more sense to you? Do you know or have examples of where supplantation is taking place? Other elements of the funding formula?
Nate.
Yes.
Nate, I'm sorry. Dr. Hickman's trying to talk. I'm not sure if his mic is messed up.
It is.
Oh,
There you go. You're not very loud, Dr. Hickman.
I'm sorry. I was trying to interrupt you, Nate. I think that if you're looking at the time, it's 5:25. I think we should just go into large group if you don't mind leading that discussion.
You know what, Dr. Hickman, I think we could just dispense with the exit ticket and wrap up and save that 10 minutes off the end. I would really like to get into small groups for a few minutes just so that everybody gets a chance to kind of get some, say something.
Good. Just wanted to make that option available for us.
I don't know that that's going to be possible, Liz. We just closed them. We had them all established, and when the decision
I can do it, Carmen.
Okay.
If that's what we're going to do.
Okay, thank you.
So,
Nate, and we'll skip past the norms. Everybody be on their best behavior when they go into the small group.
Very good.
So I was unable to hear you, Dr. Hickman, almost.
Don't worry about it. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Nate. So you were saying people should choose a question or two that resonates
most with them and to the extent, let's get ourselves in the breakout rooms and I couldn't follow that conversation. How much time are we going to have for the breakout rooms?
Why don't we do about 15 minutes?
Perfect.
And then we'll come back, do as, quick share out and then the report update. And then we'll send you off with the exit tickets this time. We won't kind of take those couple minutes, but please do respond. That'd be great. Okay. I think that we are maybe what's left is group 1.
Hey Liz, would you like me to stay on? So I'm here for the big group discussion, if that's helpful to you.
That would be wonderful, Dr. Colby, if you don't mind.
Please call me Tammy.
Sorry, Tammy. We get formal during our.
I'm not that cool. But I'm happy to stay on until I need to go pick up my daughter, if that's helpful to you.
Wonderful.
I would love to be available for questions, but I also need not if this is top secret deliberations and all of those things.
That would be great.
Okay.
All right. So folks, do we have someone who wants to raise their hand to be our share out person at the end? Looks like we have Josh, Winifred, Tom, and Delegate Plakovich Carr as our folks in this small group. Anybody interested in being the share out person?
I can do it, even though
Okay.
I stumped on it, but I will do it.
Thanks, Tom. I appreciate that.
We got to get this stuff going.
Okay, great. So which question, would folks like to start with?
I think number 2, that was
Okay.
immediately jumped again. I'm a school-based principal. So number 1, I can't answer that one, but I will say that thinking in the broad scope of from the Eastern Shore to the Western Shore and everything in between, each county is very different in what it would term per capita on as far as what the median income is. So when you think about that and you look at what local funding does versus the state, which ours is a low funding county, we have supports in place that sometimes is adequate. I need a paraprofessional work with the student that is, partially blind. However, we have certain programs that require an additional BCBA, a social worker. Unless you look at multiple weights, you can't just look at a number of 8,000 or down 8,800, whatever the number was. That number doesn't go very far when you have to look at people that are very specialized, that cost a lot more money. And then when you balance that between Washington County, then maybe Montgomery County, which has a lot more money, then this is where I think the discrepancy will come into play in the unfairness in students' faith, because Washington County might not be able to do what Montgomery County can. So I think multiple weights would make sense. And you can really look at it based off of the income level of the counties when you do it.
Well, and I guess the other piece for me is thinking about the minimum school funding, right? I just don't understand how in a single weight system you can push 75% of that money into an individual school and think that, we don't have students with disabilities with different kinds of needs evenly distributed amongst all of our schools. That just isn't the way that it works. And you're going to end up with students who have a significant need, for an entire extra adult. How is 75% of that weight going to pay for that? It only works when we pool that money and we distribute it according to need.
Yeah, and that connects to number 5, because I know in our county right now, and I think Nate kind of spoke to it a little bit briefly, but when we make a decision at an IEP meeting, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. We can make a decision, but there's a next level through central office that really is the one that decides what we can really do for students. And I think sometimes I understand the fairness piece, because we can't just make great broad strokes from each individual school with needs. However, that does impact what I know I'm going to be adequately be able to do with a student. That doesn't stop us through the identification process, but it's to actually what is the actual student's FAPE and where can we meet both, best meet these needs? That's where that gets a little bit of hairy. And that's where that would, connect to number two. Because if we didn't have to have that problem, we could probably make more decisions that meet kids' needs versus does it meet the need of the county or the spacing of the county or the staffing of the county. All right, I said a lot there.
Thanks, Tom. Donna, did you want to chime in with something?
I just want to share some context that the concept of the 75% at the school level is a floor, not a ceiling. And I think it's important to look at it that way, that that's the minimum amount, not the maximum amount. I think it's also important to note that prior to this blueprint requirement that the funding follows the child, there really was no way for the state or legislators or county officials or stakeholders or advocates to understand and see how funding that was provided for education was used to serve students. And so, I understand that people think there's issues with this, maybe not the funding follows the student mindset, but maybe the 75% component of it, but it really is intended to meet that need so that folks can see that this school has 50% of its students are students with disabilities. Of that, another 40% are economically disadvantaged and 10% are multilingual learners. You should see a lot more. Your per pupil expenditure in that school should be exponentially higher than a school with a much lower level of need.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense to me. This is the thing that's confusing to me about it. So my context is I live in Baltimore City, so we've done school-based budgeting here for a very long time. What I don't, the difference for me, the disconnect for me is that a student with a disability has required services that have to be provided to that student documented in their IEP. Whereas a student who may be economically disadvantaged, we know that that student needs additional resources and we can provide those additional resources, but there isn't a requirement about what needs to be purchased, what the services need to be extended for that student. And so,
I do think there's some, I do think that at least through the adequacy study and the work that they did was evidence-based, it was research-driven, it was reviewed and modeled by local practitioners in a hierarchical manner. So I do believe that the cost basis for the per pupil amount in the foundation program and the weights for special populations programs that are applied to that foundation program in order to get the per pupil amount for those programs. I do think that the intention was to get at those costs. I think for students with disabilities, it's obviously multidimensional, and each dimension has its own level of complexity, right? That you have in the same classroom, you could have 5 students that have an IEP because they need speech services twice a week. You could have another student that has an IEP that requires a number of related services, including maybe even a one-to-one aid, right? So that's the cost for that student is going to be exponentially higher than the cost for the students with speech needs. But if you're getting, $8,000 for speech, you don't need all $8,000 for speech. They're not saying that 75% of that cost has to be spent on that child. They're saying that of those 4 kids in that classroom with $8,000, you should get close to the state and local required funding for those children.
Yeah, it's just that the problem is that works if all the schools are 1,000 students and we've got an even distribution of those kinds of needs. But if you have a school that's got 250 students, And, six of them have extraordinary needs. You're not going to be able to meet those students' needs with that funding. So, I understand what the idea was, and I'm not disputing the idea overall, but I think in the case of students with disabilities, it breaks down pretty quickly given the specifics of the way that it's going to play out.
Right, right. And I don't disagree with that, but I also think that because 75% is the floor, not the ceiling, in that particular school that you're referencing that has only 250 students and I don't know, six students with really high needs, you're still going to see an increase in funding because the LEAs are required to serve those students. You're not going to be able to see it as special education dollars, but you're going to see a higher cost, higher level of expenditure at that
But
school.
isn't that really the challenge that 75% we're saying minimum, but you're seeing the local LEA has to pick up the additional cost. If you're not a county that has that additional monies, those resources, saying the ceiling is unlimited is unrealistic. So
that's not, I'm not saying that the ceiling is unlimited. I didn't say that. What I'm saying is that the 75% is the floor, not the ceiling. And when you look at the layer cake model, every single student in a school gets the foundation funding plus whatever other special population group that they are eligible for. So you can have, like, in the economic comp ed is classic example. We use poverty as a proxy for the research that tells us that concentrations of students in poverty at an LEA level, maybe more so than a classroom, require additional supports and services. That's a proxy. That doesn't mean they all need them, but the research says the majority do. So that's the proxy that we use. You're going to have kids who don't qualify for anything that need additional services, and you're going to have to pay for that.
But in this case, every student with a disability has an IEP that has documented required expenditures. And that's that we can't get away from that. And the reality is the 75% minimum, I understand that it's minimum, but the way that it's actually playing out is that if you look at Baltimore City's budget book, they take the bulk amount, they take out their 25% to hold back, and they distribute the 75%. So
Jill, for fiscal 25,
I think that's the way the budget book looks.
I have not seen the budget book, so I can't.
Do you think that that's specific to Baltimore City? Because Liz, I'm with you. I was thinking it through, and because of the way we do with fair student funding, like we know we have schools with low enrollment, which means less money, and there's more than 6 students. I mean, that was a generous number, but do you think that is specific to that funding? Because I wholeheartedly agree with everything you said. I'm sitting here nodding my head like, yeah, it's not going to be enough.
I don't know. I'm not sure.
Okay,
so
because
I would argue that Baltimore City would then, I would argue that maybe they need to rethink their allocation methodology. And is that really fair student funding, right? If you're
the way that they've always done it in the past has been that they were allocating special education funding based on hours of services in students' IEPs.
So they would be a really good test case to see the difference between their traditional allocation methodology and what Blueprint requires, right?
Yeah, especially because they're already most of the way there because they've always done that school-based budgeting, which we're really asking everyone to do now.
Right.
So
I think doing the budgeting and reporting the data are two different things. So.
So I think just to throw it out there, number 4 for the cost of transportation.
Yes,
definitely they could be looked into. I know more and more we have certain students that, especially with some of the changes in the last year or two, that they're being required or could be required to be in programming other than the public school setting. And depending on the availability, sometimes they're a long ways. We have kids that go all the way to Baltimore from Hagerstown every single day. And we try not to do that, but where non-publics are stopping and accepting students, that's how far you have to go. And obviously that cost factor adds up really quickly. So that, I think, something could definitely be looked at as far as the multiple weights.
Mm-hmm.
I
So
definitely
can I-
second that one because that one really resonated with me. So thank you for mentioning number 4, because that was the one I wanted to pull out as well.
So can I ask a follow-up question on that with respect to non-public placements and transportation? Is transportation a part of included in their IEP?
Yes.
Yes.
I think this is for specialized transportation, and that has to be part of the IEP.
Mm-hmm.
What do you
Yes,
mean
that
specialized
specialized.
transportation? If they go to a non-public school, it's in there.
It's in the transportation is in their IEP.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
Yes.
then that funding for that would be included in the agreement between the LEA and the non-public special education school.
Well, but you could have transportation in your IEP and not attend a non-public school. Lots of
Yeah.
students will have specialized transportation needs. They might need an aid on the bus. They might need, certain kind of or seatbelts. They might, whatever it is. And the question is one that, where did that $1,000 amount come from? And is it adequate to, again, distributed and distributed in a way that meets the needs of all kids who might have those.
Yeah, I understand the bigger picture question. I was just asking for my own personal information about non-public placements.
Got it.
Hi, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. Hey, I don't know what happened a long time ago. We have about less than a minute or two. Want to go to another question real quick, if possible, or?
Yeah, sure. What other one do people want to talk about?
If I could just jump in about number 1, I just see it across the board. We have, we can't talk about funding without, mentioning the human capital shortage that we have in special education across the board. My school in particular, there are teacher positions available, but there's no one to fill them. There are bus aid positions available. There's no one to fill them. There's one-on-one dedicated, one-on-one positions, paraprofessional positions. So with regards to funding, is probably funding that's not being utilized because, well, you can't find somebody to do what the funding is asking you to do. So that's just that's just my 2 cents when it comes to, are we adequate funding special education? We're just right now in a crisis of finding the human capital to enact this funding.
That's a good perspective. Are you saying, Josh, Mr. Schechter, that you believe that there's funding, but not the people?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Oh, yes, absolutely. I mean, there's funding. I mean, especially when we talk about transportation, I have buses that are late, or they come because you have drivers that are running different runs. There are IEP team will agree that sure, the student needs what they call in Prince George's County dedicated aid, one-on-one support. They can't get someone to fill the position. Sure, the student needs special education instruction, but they can't get the teacher. I mean, I had a chance to visit a couple different schools this week, and the one theme is that different special education programs, everyone is short, and they don't have people to fill. They want to honor the IEP. They want to honor what the teams have discussed. They don't have they can't go outside and pull the people off trees.
Yep.
Well,
Great.
thank you for
I think
that. Go ahead. You're back. Good.
we're all back. I think we'll take a few minutes for high-level quick sharing out. I do want to make sure we leave some time for the July 1 report update. But Brian, how many different groups did we have for the breakouts?
Nate, there were 4.
Okay, great, thank you. Group number 1, somebody wants to share the update?
Which one you're in.
Number 1.
We were number 1.
Tom is going to read.
Tom.
Yeah, so we talked about the multiple weights, the 75%, where that comes from. Is that adequate? I think we had some spirited discussion, which I think is outstanding. But I think there is a need, I think I felt it, that there needs to be multiple weights because every school is different, every student is different, and every support system that's within a school or a system is different. So I think we need to treat everything different. We also talked about transportation, where the $1,000 came from. Is that adequate per IEP or not? If it's in county or inside the LEA or going to non-public, I think that's something to peel back the onion a little bit and look a little bit further into that. And really, what is the cost in LEAs would probably be interesting. How much they spending beyond the allocation that they're receiving from the state. And then also, I think number 1, we talked about different funding source, and I think that's twofold. Is there staffing, even if there's money there, is there staffing to be able to fund the supports that we need? And then if you ever get to that point, and we didn't really get to talk about, then what can you do beyond that? The money that you could use and resources support to do programming that's even better. But I think we're so often in LEAs working below that level, just trying to get minimal supports, that maybe that discussion on is there adequate? I think it would be hard to tell right now, because right now none of us are probably working beyond minimally supporting what we can do for our students right now. All right, I think that's number 1. Anyone else can jump in.
Great, I appreciate that summary, Tom. Group 2 was my group. Aggie, do you mind doing if I can put you on the spot, quick sharing out?
Oh my goodness, David, help me out if I. No, we had a good spirited discussion as well. And I think there was agreement that I think we were leaning towards, I agree, there's question, is it adequate, the funding? It's hard to tell, but there's definitely agreement in our group that the equity across LEAs seems to be an issue. And then we were talking about being able to be more fluid, meaning as enrollment in different jurisdictions fluctuates throughout the year. You're talking about a big influx in Frederick County this year, for example. So having a formula that allows us to have the funds follow where kids are enrolled, but also in real time with IEP team decisions as needs are identified. Is there a way to have like the Maryland IEP system filter up and kind of help us track where funding is needed? It could change in a school year. So you might be looking at numbers from a year or 2 ago, and that's not relevant. That's not helpful.
Great, thank you. How about group 3?
All right, so we talked about number 1, the special education funding, and a couple of the locals were interested in, maybe that formula needs to be looked at because the high tax base in, like, for example, in Ocean City, which may skew some of the population, right? So many of the students might live in poverty, but because Ocean City is in there, then might skew some things. And Rundle had some concerns as well, or just in general. And then one of the things that we also discussed was the supplantation, and discuss the difference between federal supplantation and state supplantation, and the fact that we would need mechanisms in order to track state funding and local funding, right? So, federal maintenance of effort is obviously different than what would be like a state maintenance of effort. So we would have to develop that. We'd have to develop the mechanisms to track that, and then have to have policies written, and obviously some professional development. Another issue that we talked about was the issue of money following the students, right? And it could be possibly an issue for schools that have smaller amounts of students with disability, and not being able to have enough teachers, right? Enough special education teachers necessary for the school. So, example would be if there is a K-8, well, and you don't have the a high number of students with disabilities in that school, you can't have one special education teacher teaching teaching 3rd through 8th, right? So that was another discussion that we had and thought might be an issue. So.
Great. Seems like a very thoughtful conversation. Raised a lot of really interesting points. Lastly, group 4.
Are you guys okay if I share out, chime in? I will take silence as consensus or silence as a go ahead. Okay. So we tackled number 1, number 2, number 4, and number 5 in our group. So definitely around number 1 and number 4 came up with a lot of the same things, but we were looking at it, just trying to think about the bookends, right? When we're looking at the adequacy of funding and how are we spending the money, like cost of transportation, tuition, placement, things like that, is really looking at, are we really setting our kids up for success for college and career, and making sure we're doing it on the itty bitties in the early childhood and elementary in the beginning all the way through so that we really are having the best outcomes. And then really, Betsy, I want to make sure I cover just the looking at number 2 as far as weighted because of the difference of, kids with disabilities needs. And then what do those priorities need to be that really work at getting the best outcomes for our kids as it relates to funding?
Great. Well, thanks. I appreciate the conversation, appreciate the sharing out. Also appreciate that we've got about 10 minutes left, so I'm going to turn it back over to you, Liz.
I think actually it's going to go to Dr. Hickman, and he's going to maybe talk about the report. Is that right, Dr. Hickman?
That's correct. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
Advance the slides, please. So you can hear me okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. As you can see from this slide, we're on our timeline. We have done the report outline, which we shared. The first draft is complete. It's been shared with the work group. We received feedback from the work group. I must say we received minimal feedback, so therefore we're going to take it as agreement and move forward. But if you have some comments, some things that you want to add, we will definitely consider them. During this time, from the May 20th to the 31st, to the end of the week, we will be adding in the revisions that were recommended. We will share the final report with the exec team on the 31st, and then to MSDE leadership for review. From there, MSDE leadership will review and address revisions, and then we will submit to the work group and AIB by the deadline of July 1st, 2024. Comments? All right, next slide. So we would agreed not to pause today in terms of sharing the exit reflection tickets, but these are the questions you will receive. If you haven't yet, my team is pretty.
They're already there.
You have already received the link so that you can respond to the questions. Please note that your exit reflections really do help in developing the recommendation so that we can bring that information back to you. It helps us to plan for the next meeting so we can see if there are any holes or gaps that we need to address, or if we need to send any information out to you. So if you could just honor that request and look at the exit ticket and respond. And it also gives you a chance to respond if your voice wasn't heard during today's session. Next slide. So our next steps and resources, our next meeting is June 26th from 4 to 6 p.m. In a virtual format for all our participants. The topic will be on significant disproportionality. That question is, the guiding question is what statewide policies, practices, and standards, I'm reading that wrong, that should be considered to address the discriminant practices for students who are economically disadvantaged and Black or Brown for discipline and identification within certain types of disabilities. That's an important topic. I'll share with you that the work that we've been doing this year is definitely work geared towards that. So we're looking forward to your recommendations. 18 out of 24 of our school districts have been identified as significant disproportionality and under coordinated early intervention services. So this is going to be a great conversation, and it's going to give us an opportunity to take away. You will have, you will receive the takeaways from today's meeting. Reading recommendations will be coming forward, and the data and any support analysis if that was requested. You can find this information on the Workgroup, Blueprint Workgroup webpage. And next slide. Here are our future meeting dates, and I've already mentioned that Wednesday, June 26th is our next meeting date. Okay, we come to our conclusion. If there are no other comments, concerns, Liz?
Nope, got nothing else.
All right, we'll give you a minute or two back in your day. Thank you very much for joining. We'll see you next week. Do not forget those exit tickets, please.